Sarah Martinez had always been a perfectionist. At 32 years old, she managed a successful accounting firm in Denver, controlled every detail of her life, and prided herself on mastering whatever she set her mind to. That confidence crumbled the first time she picked up a rifle at the local shooting range. The instructor, a gruff former police officer named Dave, handed her a standard .22 caliber rifle and pointed toward the targets 50 meters away. Sarah adjusted her stance, squared her shoulders, and took careful aim through the iron sights. The target looked impossibly small through the aperture, but she steadied her breathing just as Dave had shown her. The first shot went wide, missing the entire target board. Sarah blinked in disbelief, certain there had been some mistake with the equipment. The second shot hit the dirt embankment behind the targets. By the 10th shot, she had managed to hit the outer edge of the target paper once, nowhere near the scoring rings. "Don't worry," Dave said, trying to sound encouraging. "Everyone struggles at first. Shooting is harder than it looks in the movies." But Sarah wasn't everyone. She had earned her CPA certification on the first try, learned 3 languages fluently, and could solve complex financial puzzles that stumped seasoned professionals. The idea that she couldn't hit a stationary target at 50 meters felt like a personal failure that cut deep into her identity. Week after week, she returned to the range, spending hundreds of dollars on ammunition and instruction. Dave worked patiently with her, adjusting her stance, correcting her grip, teaching her breathing techniques. Other shooters at the range began to recognize her as the woman who came in every Saturday morning, fired box after box of ammunition, and left, looking frustrated. Sarah's shots remained scattered across the target face like random polka dots. On good days, she might group 5 shots within a dinner plate-sized circle. On bad days, she missed the target entirely half the time. The 50-meter distance that seemed so achievable when she started now felt like an impossible chasm between her rifle and any meaningful accuracy. Her friends and family didn't understand her obsession. "Why does it matter?" her sister asked during one of their weekly phone calls. "It's just a hobby. You're already successful at everything that counts." But Sarah couldn't let it go. She had discovered something she genuinely couldn't master, and it haunted her thoughts during long days at the office. She found herself researching shooting techniques online, watching YouTube videos of competitive marksmen, and reading forums where people discussed the finer points of rifle accuracy. The more she learned, the more she realized how much she didn't know. The breaking point came on a particularly windy Saturday morning in October. Sarah had been shooting for 6 months, and Dave suggested she try for her first qualifying score in a basic marksmanship competition. The course of fire required 10 shots at 50 meters, with a minimum score needed to pass. Sarah loaded her rifle with trembling hands, acutely aware of the small crowd that had gathered to watch. The wind was gusting across the range, making the flags dance and adding another variable she hadn't mastered. She fired her first shot and saw it strike low and to the left. The second shot went high and right. By the 5th shot, her frustration was building into something close to panic. Her final score was barely half of what she needed to qualify. As Sarah packed up her equipment, fighting back tears of frustration, she overheard 2 experienced shooters discussing her performance. "Poor girl just doesn't have the natural ability," one said. "Some people are born with steady hands and good eyes. Others aren't." That night, Sarah sat in her apartment surrounded by shooting manuals and printouts of training exercises, feeling more defeated than she had since failing her driver's test at 16. She had invested months of time, considerable money, and significant emotional energy into something that seemed determined to remain beyond her reach. But as she stared at her collection of scattered target sheets, each one a record of missed shots and dashed expectations, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't ready to quit. She just needed to find a different approach, a teacher who could unlock whatever potential lay hidden beneath her current limitations. She spent that evening researching advanced shooting instructors in Colorado, looking for someone who specialized in helping struggling marksmen. Most of the names she found were former military or law enforcement officers who worked with already competent shooters. She needed someone who could work miracles with someone who couldn't, even consistently hit a target at 50 meters. That's when she found a small classified ad in a local shooting magazine. Precision rifle instruction for all skill levels. Military-trained instructor specializes in fundamental accuracy development. No shooter left behind. The phone number led to a voice message system with a gravelly voice that simply said, "Leave your name and number. If you're serious about learning, I'll call you back." Sarah left her message that night, not knowing she had just taken the first step toward a transformation that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her own limitations. The instructor who would call her back had spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL sniper, and he had never met a student he couldn't teach to shoot with lethal precision. The call came 3 days later while Sarah was reviewing quarterly reports at her office. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is Marcus. Webb, you left a message about shooting instruction. Tell me about your experience and what you're trying to accomplish." Sarah found herself explaining her 6 months of frustration, her inability to hit targets consistently at 50 meters, and her determination to improve despite what seemed like a complete lack of natural ability. She expected Marcus to politely decline as 2 other instructors had done when she described her skill level. Instead, there was a long pause before Marcus spoke again. "Meet me at Riverside Range tomorrow at 600 hours. Bring your rifle and whatever ammunition you've been using. Don't bring any preconceived notions about what you can or can't do." Sarah arrived at the range the next morning to find a man who looked nothing like what she had expected. Marcus Webb was in his early 40s, of average height and build, with graying hair and weathered hands. He wore simple jeans and a plain baseball cap, looking more like a suburban dad than a former Navy SEAL sniper. The only hint of his military background was the way he carried himself, with a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from his core. "Show me how you normally shoot," Marcus said without preamble, gesturing toward the 50-meter line. Sarah set up her rifle on the bench, checked her scope settings, and fired 5 shots at a standard bullseye target. The grouping was typical for her recent performance, scattered across a 10-inch circle with no discernible pattern. She turned to Marcus, expecting to see the familiar look of disappointment she had grown accustomed to receiving from instructors. Instead, Marcus was studying the target through a spotting scope, making notes on a small pad. "Interesting," he murmured. "Your shots aren't random. There's a pattern here, but it's being masked by fundamental issues we can fix." For the next hour, Marcus didn't let Sarah fire a single shot. Instead, he had her practice dry firing exercises, working on trigger control, breathing, and sight alignment. He watched her like a scientist observing a laboratory experiment, occasionally stopping her to make minute adjustments to her position or grip. "In the SEAL teams we had a saying," Marcus told her as she practiced her breathing rhythm. "There are no bad shooters, only bad teachers and students who haven't learned how their individual systems work yet. Every person has a unique combination of physical and mental characteristics that affect their shooting. My job is to figure out your specific puzzle and teach you how to solve it." Marcus explained that most civilian shooting instructors taught generic techniques that worked for average students. But Sarah wasn't average in several important ways. She was left-eye dominant but right-handed, had slightly asymmetrical vision, and possessed an analytical mind that was actually working against her by overthinking each shot. "Your brain is your biggest asset in business," Marcus said, "but it's sabotaging you here. You're trying to consciously control processes that need to become subconscious. We're going to rewire how you approach shooting from the ground up." The first lesson ended without Sarah firing a single live round. Marcus assigned her homework, 20 minutes of daily dry fire practice using specific drills he demonstrated. He also gave her a small notebook and instructed her to record detailed observations about her shooting routine, including her mood, physical condition, and environmental factors. "Most people think shooting is about the gun," Marcus said as they packed up equipment. "But shooting is about the shooter. The rifle is just a tool. Until we optimize the human operating that tool, expensive equipment and advanced techniques won't help." Sarah left that first lesson feeling more hopeful than she had in months. Marcus hadn't promised quick results or easy solutions, but he had identified specific problems she never knew existed. More importantly, he spoke about her shooting challenges as puzzles to be solved rather than limitations to be accepted. Over the following week, Sarah threw herself into the dry fire exercises with the same intensity she brought to tack season. She practiced trigger control until her finger moved in perfectly straight lines. She worked on sight alignment until she could consistently center the front sight post without conscious thought. She filled pages in her shooting journal with observations about her stance, breathing, and mental state. When she returned to the range the following Saturday, Marcus had her shoot just 3 rounds. All 3 shots hit within a 6-inch circle at 50 meters, better than anything she had achieved in 6 months of previous training. "Good," Marcus said, making notes on his pad. "We've addressed the basic mechanical issues. Now we start working on the mental game. That's where real precision begins." Sarah stared at her target, hardly believing the improvement. "How is this possible? I've been trying to do this for months." Marcus smiled, the first time she had seen any expression beyond professional assessment on his face. "You've been trying to force your body to do things it wasn't ready to do. We're going to teach your body to do things it wants to do naturally. There's a big difference." As they walked back to the parking lot, Marcus mentioned almost casually that his best students could typically achieve consistent accuracy at distances most people considered impossible for civilian shooters. "How far?" Sarah asked, curious about the limits of precision shooting. "Depends on the student and how hard they're willing to work," Marcus replied. "But I've taught accountants and teachers to hit targets at distances that would surprise you. The human eye and a good rifle are capable of much more than most people realize." Sarah drove home that day thinking about distances and possibilities she had never imagined. She didn't yet know that Marcus was already planning a training progression that would eventually take her far beyond anything she thought possible for someone who had struggled so much with basic marksmanship. The transformation began with what Marcus called deconstructing bad habits. For 3 weeks, he refused to let Sarah shoot beyond 25 meters, despite her protests that she had already proven she could hit targets at that distance. Accuracy at longer ranges is built on perfection at shorter ranges, Marcus explained during one particularly frustrating session. If you can't put 10 shots through the same hole at 25 meters, you have no business shooting at 100 meters, much less beyond that. Sarah discovered that shooting well was far more complex than she had imagined. Marcus introduced concepts she had never heard from other instructors: natural point of aim, skeletal support, pulse timing, and what he called the shooter's trance. Each element had to be mastered individually before being integrated into a complete system. The natural point of aim lesson was a revelation. Marcus had Sarah get into position, close her eyes, and fire a dry shot. When she opened her eyes, her crosshairs had drifted several inches from where she had originally aimed. "Your body wants to point in a slightly different direction than where you're forcing it to aim," Marcus explained. "Fighting your natural alignment creates tension, and tension creates inconsistency. We need to adjust your position so your natural point of aim matches your intended target." They spent an entire morning session just finding Sarah's perfect shooting position. Marcus adjusted her body placement in tiny increments until she could close her eyes, relax completely, and have her crosshairs settle exactly on the center of the target when she reopened them. The mental aspects of shooting proved even more challenging than the physical techniques. Marcus taught Sarah meditation exercises designed specifically for marksmen, techniques he had learned during advanced SEAL training. She learned to slow her heart rate at will, to find the natural pause between heartbeats where the rifle was most stable. "Elite snipers don't just aim and fire," Marcus said during one of their theory sessions. "They enter an altered state of consciousness where time seems to slow down and distractions disappear. It's similar to what athletes call the zone, but more intense and focused." Sarah practiced these mental techniques obsessively, treating them like complex accounting problems that could be solved through analysis and repetition. She learned to clear her mind of everything except the relationship between her crosshairs and the target center. She discovered she could make her breathing so shallow that her rifle barely moved with each breath. After a month of foundational training, Marcus finally allowed Sarah to shoot at 50 meters again. The improvement was dramatic. Her groups had shrunk from dinner plate-sized scattered shots to tight clusters that could be covered by a silver dollar. More importantly, The groups were consistent. She could produce similar results shot after shot, session after session. "Now we start building distance gradually," Marcus announced. "But first, you need to understand your equipment limitations and how to work within them." Marcus taught Sarah about ballistics in terms that made sense to her analytical mind. He explained how bullets were affected by gravity, wind, air pressure, and temperature. He showed her ballistics charts that looked like complex mathematical formulas, which Sarah absorbed with the same intensity she brought to financial projections. "Your rifle and ammunition combination has specific capabilities," Marcus said, as they chronographed her loads with electronic equipment. "Understanding those capabilities is crucial for consistent long-range shooting. You can't compensate for variables you don't understand." They moved to 75 meters, then 100 meters. At each distance, Sarah had to prove she could consistently hit a target the size of a tea saucer before Marcus would allow her to shoot farther. The progression was methodical and sometimes maddeningly slow, but the results spoke for themselves. At 100 meters, Sarah was achieving groups that would have seemed impossible during her early days of training. 5-shot groups that could be covered by a quarter became routine. More significantly, she was developing what Marcus called shooter's confidence, the quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly what will happen when the trigger breaks. Confidence is the difference between a good shooter and a great one, Marcus explained after Sarah fired a particularly impressive group. When you know with absolute certainty that your shot will go exactly where you aim it, you can focus on the things that really matter: reading wind, judging distance, timing your shot for optimal conditions. Sarah began to understand that precision. Shooting was as much about problem-solving as it was about physical skill. Each shot required analyzing multiple variables: wind direction and speed, lighting conditions, her own physical and mental state, and making tiny adjustments based on that analysis. Marcus introduced more advanced concepts as Sarah's skills progressed. She learned to read mirage patterns to judge wind speed, to use her scope's focus ring as a rough rangefinder, and to make precise adjustments based on bullet impact patterns. Each lesson built upon previous knowledge, creating a comprehensive understanding of precision shooting that went far beyond simply aiming and firing. The breakthrough came during their 8th week of training. Sarah was shooting at 125 meters when Marcus called out wind corrections from his spotting scope. Following his guidance, Sarah made minute adjustments to her aim point and squeezed off a shot. The bullet struck dead center in the target's bullseye. The second shot opened a slightly larger hole in the same location. By the 5th shot, Sarah had fired a group so tight that all 5 bullets could be covered by a dime. Marcus studied the target through his spotting scope for a long moment before speaking. "That," he said quietly, "is what real precision looks like. And that's just the beginning of what you're capable of achieving." Sarah stared at her target, hardly believing what she had accomplished. 6 months earlier, she couldn't hit a target consistently at 50 meters. Now she was shooting groups at over twice that distance that would impress experienced marksmen. But Marcus was already planning the next phase of her training, involving distances and challenges that would push her, abilities far beyond anything she had yet imagined. Marcus waited until Sarah had mastered 150 meters before revealing his true training plan. They were sitting in his pickup truck after a successful morning session when he pulled out a detailed map of Colorado's high country. "There's a private range about 2 hours from here," Marcus said, pointing to a remote location in the mountains. "The owner is a friend of mine from my SEAL days. The range has targets set up at distances most civilians never get to experience." Sarah studied the map, noting the elevation markings and isolated location. "How far are we talking about?" "The longest lane goes out to 3,000 meters, Marcus replied casually. "But we'll work up to that gradually. Most people think long-range shooting starts at 300 meters. In the military, we consider that barely warm-up distance." Sarah felt her stomach flutter with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. 300 meters was twice as far as her current maximum range, and Marcus was talking about distances 10 times beyond that. "Do you really think I can shoot that far?" she asked. Marcus studied her with the same analytical gaze she had learned to recognize over their months of training. Sarah, you've progressed faster than any student I've ever trained. Your analytical mind and obsessive attention to detail are perfect for extreme long-range shooting. The question isn't whether you can do it, but how far you're willing to push yourself. The following weekend, they made their first trip to what Marcus called the long-range facility. The drive took them through winding mountain roads to an elevation of nearly 8,000 feet. The range itself was a natural valley with targets placed at precisely measured distances across a mile of open terrain. Sarah's first look through Marcus's high-powered spotting scope at the 300-meter target was sobering. The bullseye that had seemed reasonably sized at shorter distances now appeared as a tiny speck barely visible through her rifle scope. "Different game now," Marcus said, setting up his equipment. "At these distances, everything matters more. Wind that wouldn't affect a shot at 100 meters can throw you completely off target at 300. Elevation changes become critical. Your ammunition's consistency becomes the difference between hits and misses." They spent that first day at the long-range facility just getting Sarah comfortable with the distance. Her groups at 300 meters were larger than she was used to, but Marcus seemed pleased with her performance. "Most experienced shooters struggle when they first jump to these distances," he explained. "You're adapting faster than I expected. Part of it is your mental approach. You're not fighting the difficulty, you're analyzing it and adapting to it." Over subsequent weekend trips to the mountain range, Sarah's capabilities expanded dramatically. Marcus introduced her to advanced ballistics software that calculated precise trajectories based on altitude, temperature, humidity, and bullet specifications. She learned to use a range-finding device that could measure distances to the nearest meter at extreme ranges. The mental game became even more critical at longer distances. Marcus taught Sarah visualization techniques where she would mentally rehearse perfect shots before touching the trigger. She learned to enter what he called sniper time, a meditative state where her awareness narrowed to just the relationship between her crosshairs and the target. "At long range, patience becomes a weapon," Marcus explained during one session. "You might wait 15 minutes for wind conditions to be exactly right for one shot. Rushing or forcing shots at these distances guarantees failure." Sarah discovered she had an intuitive understanding of wind reading that surprised even Marcus. She could look at grass patterns, mirage effects, and dust movements across the range and accurately predict wind speeds and directions. Her business background in analyzing complex data patterns translated perfectly to reading environmental conditions. At 500 meters, Sarah achieved her first cold-bore hit, a perfect center shot with a rifle that hadn't been fired all day. At 600 meters, she learned to make precise adjustments for the Coriolis effect, where the Earth's rotation actually affects bullet trajectory over very long distances. Marcus began introducing scenarios that simulated real-world shooting challenges. Sarah learned to shoot from awkward positions, to compensate for unstable shooting platforms, and to make rapid calculations for targets at unknown distances. Each session pushed her further into the realm of expert marksmanship. The breakthrough moment came during their 6th trip to the mountain range. Sarah had been shooting consistently well at distances up to 800 meters when Marcus pointed to a target she had never attempted before. 1,000 meters, he said simply. "Just over half a mile. At this distance, your bullet will be in flight for over a second. You'll actually hear the impact before the sound of your shot returns to you." Sarah studied the distant target through her scope, making minute adjustments for the significant bullet drop at that range. The wind was tricky, switching directions slightly every few minutes. She waited patiently, watching grass patterns and mirage through her scope until conditions aligned perfectly. The shot broke cleanly, and Sarah watched through her scope as the bullet struck the target dead center. The metallic ring of the bullet, hitting steel, reached them a full second later, followed by the returning echo of her rifle shot. Marcus lowered his spotting scope and looked at Sarah with something approaching amazement. 14 months ago, you couldn't hit a target at 50 meters. You just made a perfect shot at 20 times that distance." Sarah felt a surge of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced in her professional life. The shot required every skill Marcus had taught her, from fundamental shooting techniques to advanced ballistics calculations. to reading environmental conditions that changed by the minute. But Marcus was already studying targets even further, downrange, calculating the challenges that would come with pushing Sarah's abilities to their absolute limits. The targets at the far end of the valley represented distances that tested the boundaries of what was possible with conventional rifle equipment. Ready for the next challenge? Marcus asked, his tone suggesting that everything they had accomplished so far was merely preparation for what lay ahead. Sarah looked through her scope at the barely visible targets in the distance, knowing that Marcus was about to push her abilities into territory that few civilian shooters ever explored. The accountant who had once struggled with basic marksmanship was about to discover just how far human precision could extend. Marcus waited until Sarah had achieved consistent success at 1,200 meters before introducing the concept that would define the final phase of her training. They were reviewing her shooting journal over coffee when he mentioned almost casually that some of his former SEAL teammates held informal records for extreme long-range shots with standard equipment. What kind of distances? Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer would challenge everything she thought she knew about the limits of precision shooting. The current record among guys I trained with is 2,800 meters, Marcus said, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. Just over 1.5 miles. It's not a military record, those are classified, but it's what one of my buddies achieved during a training exercise in Afghanistan. Sarah did the math quickly. 2,800 meters was more than double her current maximum range and represented a distance where bullets would be affected by factors she had never even considered. The shot would require precision beyond anything she had imagined possible. Is that even achievable with civilian equipment? She asked. Marcus smiled, the expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this question. That depends entirely on the shooter. The equipment is capable. The question is whether we can develop your skills to match the equipment's potential. Over the following weeks, Marcus introduced Sarah to the extreme challenges of ultra-long-range shooting. At distances beyond 1,500 meters, factors that were negligible at shorter ranges became critical variables that could mean the difference between hits and complete misses. Sarah learned about advanced ballistics concepts that sounded more like physics than marksmanship training. She studied how air density changes with altitude affected bullet flight, how temperature variations could alter projectile velocity, and how the Coriolis effect became increasingly significant as bullet flight time extended beyond 2 seconds. At an extreme range, you're not just shooting a rifle, Marcus explained as they worked with ballistic software that calculated trajectories with scientific precision. You're conducting a physics experiment where dozens of variables have to align perfectly for success. Marcus upgraded Sarah's equipment for the extreme distance work. Her rifle received a precision barrel and advanced optics capable of the precise adjustments required for ultra-long-range work. Her ammunition was hand-loaded to specifications that ensured each round was identical to within tiny tolerances. The mental preparation became as important as the technical aspects. Marcus taught Sarah meditation techniques used by military snipers, for shots where missing could mean life or death. She learned to control not just her breathing and heartbeat, but to enter a mental state where external distractions simply ceased to exist. At these distances, there's no room for any doubt or hesitation, Marcus said during one particularly intensive training session. By the time you squeeze the trigger, you have to know with absolute certainty that every variable has been accounted for and that the shot will be perfect. Sarah's progression to extreme distances was methodical and demanding. Each 100-meter increase in distance required mastering new challenges and refining techniques that had seemed adequate at shorter ranges. At 1,800 meters, she learned to account for minute changes in atmospheric pressure that weather reports couldn't predict. At 2,200 meters, she discovered that even her heartbeat could affect the rifle's stability during the extended time required to line up such precise shots. The preparation for attempting the 2,800-meter shot took weeks. Marcus used military contacts to obtain detailed atmospheric data for their planned shooting session. Sarah spent hours with ballistics software, calculating exact trajectories and developing precise holdover points for her scope. They practiced the shot sequence repeatedly using dry-fire exercises until Sarah could execute the entire routine without conscious thought. The day chosen for the attempt was perfect. Clear skies, stable atmospheric conditions, and winds that were consistent across the entire range. Marcus had positioned wind flags at strategic points throughout the valley to help Sarah read conditions along the bullet's entire flight path. Sarah spent nearly an hour preparing for the single shot. She verified her range calculations, studied wind patterns through high-powered optics, and entered the deep meditative state that extreme long-range shooting required. The target at 2,800 meters was barely visible even through her high-powered scope, appearing as a tiny speck that required perfect focus to distinguish from the landscape behind it. "Remember," Marcus said quietly as Sarah settled into her final shooting position, "everything you've learned over the past 18 months has prepared you for this moment. Trust your training, trust your calculations, and trust yourself." Sarah's breathing slowed to barely perceptible levels as she found her natural respiratory pause. Her crosshairs settled on the precise point she had calculated, accounting for bullet drop that would arc her projectile nearly 30 feet above the line of sight before falling back to the target. The trigger pressure built gradually until the shot broke with surgical precision. The bullet's flight time at that distance was over 3 seconds, long enough for Sarah to follow its path through her scope and watch it strike the target dead center. The metallic ring of the impact reached them nearly 4 seconds after the shot, followed by the returning echo of her rifle's report rolling back across the valley. Marcus lowered his spotting scope with an expression of quiet amazement. "Perfect. Center hit," he said simply. 2,800 meters with a cold bore shot. Sarah remained in position for several minutes, hardly believing what she had accomplished. The woman who had once struggled to hit targets at 50 meters had just achieved a shot that would impress military snipers and competitive long-range shooters worldwide. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked as Sarah finally sat up from her rifle. Sarah considered the question carefully. She felt transformed, not just as a shooter, but as a person who had discovered capabilities she never knew existed within herself. The journey from complete beginner to expert marksman had taught her lessons that extended far beyond shooting technique. "I feel like I understand something about human potential that I never knew before," she said finally. 6 months ago, if someone had told me this was possible, I would have thought they were crazy. Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "That's the real lesson here. It's not about the shooting, though that's impressive enough. It's about discovering that the limits we accept for ourselves are usually much smaller than our actual capabilities." As they packed up their equipment, Sarah realized that achieving the 2,800-meter shot wasn't an ending, but a beginning. She had discovered not just a skill, but a passion that would continue challenging and rewarding her for years to come. 2 years after her first successful shot at 2,800 meters, Sarah found herself standing at the same range where she had once struggled to hit targets at 50 meters. But this time, she wasn't the student. Across from her stood Jennifer, a nervous 30-something teacher who had been struggling with basic marksmanship for months. "I just can't seem to get the hang of it," Jennifer said, examining her scattered shots on a target that looked remarkably similar to Sarah's early attempts. "Maybe I just don't have the natural ability for this." Sarah smiled, remembering when she had said almost identical words to Marcus Webb. "Let me see how you're setting up your position," she said, falling naturally into the patient instructional tone she had learned from her former teacher. The transformation in Sarah's life had been complete. She had maintained her successful accounting practice, but precision shooting had become far more than a hobby. She competed regularly in long-range competitions, often placing among the top finishers against shooters with decades of experience. More importantly, she had begun teaching others who struggled with the same challenges she had once faced. Marcus had encouraged her to become an instructor, recognizing that her analytical background and recent experience as a learning shooter gave her unique insights into helping frustrated beginners. "The best teachers," he had told her, "are often people who had to overcome significant obstacles to master their skills. They understand the learning process in ways that natural talents never can." Sarah had developed her own teaching methodology that combined Marcus's systematic approach with techniques specifically designed for students who struggled with traditional instruction. She specialized in working with what she called analytical learners, people whose logical minds sometimes worked against them in activities requiring intuitive skills. Jennifer proved to be exactly the type of student Sarah understood best. Like Sarah had been, Jennifer was successful in her professional life but frustrated by her inability to master something that seemed simple in theory. She overthought every shot, tensed up when she should have relaxed, and grew increasingly frustrated with each missed target. "The first thing we're going to do," Sarah said, "is not shoot at all. I know that sounds counterproductive, but trust me on this." For the next hour, Sarah worked with Jennifer on the same fundamental dry fire exercises that Marcus had taught her years earlier. She watched Jennifer's trigger control, corrected her breathing rhythm, and helped her find a natural, shooting position that worked with her body rather than against it. "You're fighting yourself," Sarah explained, adjusting Jennifer's grip slightly. "Your conscious mind is trying to control processes that work better when they become automatic. We need to build the right habits first, then let them work without interference." Sarah found that teaching forced her to understand her own shooting skills at a deeper level. Explaining complex concepts to beginners required breaking down techniques she had internalized until they became second nature. She discovered she could identify fundamental problems in seconds that had taken her months to recognize in herself. Over the following weeks, Jennifer's progress followed a pattern Sarah had seen in several students. Initial frustration gave way to steady improvement as fundamental techniques became automatic. Jennifer's groups at 50 meters shrank from scattered patterns to tight clusters that would have amazed her during her first lesson. "How far do you think I could eventually shoot?" Jennifer asked during one session, echoing the question Sarah had once posed to Marcus. Sarah considered the question carefully, remembering Marcus's answer about human potential being largely limited by what people believed possible. "That depends entirely on how far you want to push yourself. I've learned that most limits exist in our minds rather than in our actual capabilities." Sarah's reputation as an instructor grew as word spread about her success with struggling students. She found herself working with people from all backgrounds: business professionals, retirees, even some experienced shooters who had plateaued and needed fresh perspectives on advanced techniques. Each student taught Sarah something new about the learning process and about the wide range of approaches that could lead to marksmanship success. Some students responded to technical explanations, others needed emotional support and encouragement, and still others required completely customized approaches based on their individual challenges. Marcus occasionally visited Sarah's classes, observing with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher watching his former student excel in ways he had only hoped possible. "You've become the kind of instructor I always hoped to be," he told Sarah after watching her work with a particularly challenging student. "You understand that teaching shooting is really about teaching people to believe in capabilities they didn't know they possessed." Sarah's most rewarding moments came when former students returned to share their achievements. Jennifer, her first student, eventually achieved consistent accuracy at 400 meters and won her first precision rifle competition. Another student, a retired engineer named Robert, who had initially struggled even more than Sarah had, went on to hit targets at distances exceeding 1,000 meters. "You gave me something I thought was impossible," Robert told Sarah during one of his visits to the range. "But more than that, you taught me that the word impossible is usually just another way of saying, I haven't learned how yet." Sarah's teaching had evolved to include not just technical instruction, but life coaching principles that extended far beyond marksmanship. She helped students understand that the patience, persistence, and analytical thinking required for precision shooting were transferable skills that could improve performance in any challenging endeavor. The accounting practice that had once defined Sarah's identity became just one aspect of a much richer life. She still managed her business successfully, but her real passion was evident every weekend at the range, working with students who reminded her of her own journey from complete beginner to expert marksman. Sarah had also become involved in competitive shooting at the highest levels, representing her state in national championships and serving as a mentor for younger competitors. Her story had been featured in shooting magazines as an inspiration for adult learners who believed they had missed their opportunity to excel in precision sports. But perhaps the most significant change in Sarah's life was her perspective on human potential. The woman who had once accepted that some people were simply born with certain abilities now understood that excellence was usually the result of proper instruction, persistent practice, and refusing to accept artificial limitations. During quiet moments at the range, Sarah sometimes reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a frustrated beginner into an expert instructor. The rifle techniques and ballistics knowledge were important, but the real lesson had been about the power of finding the right teacher and the courage to continue pursuing something that initially seemed beyond her reach. Marcus still occasionally joined Sarah's advanced classes, watching with pride as his former student helped others discover their own hidden capabilities. "The cycle continues," he said during one such visit. "The best thing about teaching someone to exceed their own expectations is watching them teach others to do the same." Sarah's students now included people from across the country who sought her out specifically because of her reputation for helping struggling shooters achieve remarkable transformations. Each new student brought unique challenges that forced Sarah to continue developing as both a marksman and an instructor. The range where Sarah had once struggled to hit targets at 50 meters had become a place where she regularly helped students achieve precision that amazed even experienced shooters. Her office wall displayed not just her business certifications, but also photographs of students with their targets, documenting shots that represented personal victories against self-imposed limitations. As Sarah worked with Jennifer on an advanced breathing technique during their latest lesson, she realized that her greatest achievement wasn't the 2,800-meter shot that had once seemed impossible. It was the understanding that human potential was far more flexible and expandable than most people ever dared to believe. "Ready to try for 300 meters?" Sarah asked Jennifer, noting the confidence and precision that had replaced her student's initial uncertainty. Jennifer nodded eagerly, no longer the nervous beginner who had doubted her own capabilities. She had learned the same lesson that Sarah had discovered years earlier, that with proper instruction, persistent effort, and the courage to push beyond comfortable limits, almost any goal could eventually be achieved. Sarah smiled as she watched Jennifer prepare for her longest shot attempt, remembering her own excitement and nervousness when Marcus had first suggested distances that seemed impossible. The cycle of learning, achieving, and teaching others was continuing, proving that excellence in any field was not about innate talent, but about finding the right guidance and refusing to accept premature defeat. The woman who couldn't hit a target at 50 meters had not only learned to strike targets at extreme distances, but had discovered a calling that would help countless others make similar transformations in their own lives.